Friday for you from Los Angeles. I'm Brooks Melchior. Huge show today. We're going to be talking, of course, we're going to be talking about football. What do you think we're going to be talking about? And we're going to lead off with a guy who's about to meet with Bruce Arians down in Tampa, Greg Allman, who is the Tampa Bay beat writer for The Athletic, and he's going to give us Buccaneers Panthers. God knows there's a lot of questions coming out of even for Tampa Bay people. We're all kind of like, what's going on with Cam? I mean, what's the story? What's going on with the foot? I question, what's up with his foot? Is that why he's not running? Is he just gotten a beat down for 10 years and it's caught up to him? Is his arm? Whatever. We're going to talk to Greg and we'll talk to him about the Bucs and what their prospects are. And Jameis Winston with a solid kind of a game management performance yesterday. But I want some clues on the Buccaneers if this team is actually for real. So source, Greg Allman coming up from The Athletic. Unbelievable college football lineup. But we're going to try to put out the fire and the controversy that I must admit fan the flames on in a profound way. I think I personally extended the story on Twitter, which can happen. So to the source on this story, or one of the big sources, one of the credible sources, done the work. He's done the freedom. I mean, Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman did a Freedom of Information Act request for their records on the air conditioning. They have this Excel spreadsheet that tracks the temperature and all these other statistics in the LSU locker room. This whole story is, it came out early. There's a possibility that LSU didn't have air conditioning in the locker room at Texas when game time temperature was 98 degrees. And the head coach at LSU said, we're not really sure what he said. I mean, I saw him on tape, on video, saying, at least we had air, but we brought some blowers in. And so it was okay, but it was a little stuffy. But then come to find out, USA Today has a quote today where he said there was no air conditioning. You've got stories on both sides. I don't want to go through the whole thing and get in the weeds. We got games coming up. It's not that big of a deal. Of course, I made it a big deal, but it's not that big of a deal. So we're going to talk to the guy that I think can help to put it to bed. Forget about it. Move on. That's Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman. And we're going to talk about Texas. We're going to talk about Oklahoma. Is Texas potentially, even though they lost to LSU, a college football playoff team? Of course, a lot of people would have liked to have thought that after the win over Georgia. Now we don't know. I mean, was LSU's performance a function of Texas having a horrible defense? Or was it Joe Burrow, LSU, and the new passing game is just that good? Of course, we're going to ask Brian that. And we're going to ask him about the prospects of the Longhorns, what's going on in the Big 12, and their upcoming game next month against Oklahoma, which is going to be crucial. Oklahoma State, are they a player? Is there anybody out there that's an outlier that we don't know about? Somehow I doubt it, but that's the Big 12. So we'll do that. And then later on, to me, what's going to be perhaps the biggest story of the year in sports, and we called that right on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. We called it last week. And if you watch, I know you remember, SB 206, you're talking about college football players at UCLA, USC, Cal, Stanford, Fresno State, other major college football programs in California getting paid. The California State Assembly has passed a bill. They voted it not quite into law because the governor has to sign it in the next 30 days. If he does nothing, it goes into law. Gavin Newsom is the governor of California, where I am right now. But it looks like it's going to go into law. Okay? And in 2023, USC, UCLA, Stanford, Cal athletes will be able to benefit financially from their likeness and their name. This is new. You can't do that in college sports. This is new. And if that happens, you can bet, first of all, the NCAA is going to scratch and claw. And we've already heard some ridiculous rhetoric from the Ohio State president on the subject, I addressed it on Twitter today saying that those 4 big schools in the Pac-12, well, they would be barred from competing for NCAA championships. This is Ohio State President Michael Drake. If you look at my Twitter, you'll see it. And we'll look at the Fancred app on this. Go in there, and I want to do some posting on that as well about this subject with Ohio State people particularly. But Michael Drake is the Ohio State president. He came out and said, if this law goes into effect in the state of California, that the NCAA is going to bar those schools from NCAA championships. And guess what? That means they're out. They're out of the NCAA. That's why you're in the NCAA. I mean, Ohio State, if you were to say, we're barring Ohio State from competing for NCAA championships, what does that mean? It means they can't be in the Final Four? They can't play in the college football playoff? You see what I mean? Not going to happen. President Drake is on the wrong side of history, and we're going to continue to confront him, as you should be, because he's on Twitter. Made the mistake of being on Twitter, shooting his mouth off. And we'll talk more about that later on in the show with Steve Berkowitz of USA Today, who is one of the top reporters on this subject. He's the guy who brought Michael Drake, the president of Ohio State, out of the shadows. You can see how the NCAA is scheming now. And, of course, Drake is part of that. He's part of the big board of trustees at the NCAA. And, of course, the NCAA is saying this is unconstitutional. I've got more thoughts on it. I don't want to get in the weeds on it right now because we're going to talk football of the NFL variety coming up with Greg Allman here in a second. And then at 1:30, we're going to have Barton Simmons of 24/7 Sports. He's the director of scouting, giving us the best college football breakdown you can get in the country. But first, we're going to go down to Tampa, and we're going to talk to Greg Allman of The Athletic. He is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers beat writer, longtime fixture as a reporter in that region, longtime friend of mine. And Greg's going to join us right now. We're going to bring him up on the show. Sports by Brooks on Fancred. Hey, Greg, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Technology. Here we are. So, first off, you're in the facility right now at Tampa Bay?
Yeah, back in Tampa. Kind of crazy half a day here.
And you got Bruce Arians coming up. What do you foresee him being asked? What are some of the details that are going to come up just in that press conference approaching?
Yeah, I think we got him a fair amount last night. There's always stuff you forget in the scrum after a game. So asked him a fair amount about the defense, obviously, which stepped up so big for him last night in getting his first win with the Bucs. There's lots of things I want to ask about the officiating, some really strange plays, how they were handled, challenges that were made, challenges that weren't made, some odd things that I'm still curious. He sometimes will be a little bit candid about the officiating. I don't want to get him fined, but I'm curious what he has to say.
What, coach, you've been around it a long time down there. Is he a difference maker? Is this going to be a different team?
Last night certainly makes it easier to say that. That first game had a lot of the same kind of mistakes they'd had in the past, penalties, offensive turnovers. But last night was probably a blueprint for what they want, a much improved defense under Todd Bowles, Jameis Winston going mistake-free for an entire game, just enough of a run game to salt out a victory. They have not been a good road team at all in the last 2 years, but a big win that gets them kind of back to 1-1 where a lot of people thought they might be after 2 games.
Talking to Greg Allman of The Athletic, covers the Tampa Bay Buccaneers beat in Tampa. Jameis Winston, he almost looked like a game manager last night. Very different look for him. Do you think Arians is having a major – it certainly looks like to me. It didn't look like Jameis Winston that we normally see.
It was funny, and that we asked Jameis, what did Bruce tell you? What was the advice going in? And it was like, no, man, go out there, sling it, be you, really? That kind of thing, which is funny because it's like that really wasn't him. Right. I don't know that there were really that many plays at all yesterday where there even was the threat of a turnover with Jameis. Sometimes he'll go interception free, but it's like this guy dropped a pick and this fumble was recovered by the offense. He played a very safe game yesterday. Didn't throw for that many yards. I think there were like 5 minutes left when he broke 200 yards passing. But again, if your defense can play well, which is not something he's been able to say with any regularity in his career, you don't have to. He threw the ball 26 times less than Cam Newton did yesterday, which is not something I would have said going in is going to happen.
What about the defense? And I want to ask you about the personnel of the defense because they played well, but also the impact of Todd Bowles. What's the percent there? How important is Todd Bowles, that defense, and what about the personnel?
Yeah, I think hugely important. I mean, they have made some big changes with personnel. They've put a lot of draft picks into that side of the ball. But it's a different mindset. It's a much more aggressive, attacking defense. I think the guys that are the same personnel that are back are a lot more confident as a result. Vernon Hargreaves, when he's been healthy the last 2 years, has kind of been in a soft playing off the ball type coverage. He's a lot more involved at the line of scrimmage, attacking the guys he's covering. Had a pick six in week one, and then had easily the biggest play of the game last night in this crazy 4th and 1 play with a minute and a half left, where he kind of reads it properly and rides Christian McCaffrey out of bounds for no gain for the third 4th and 1 stop of the game. So I think Todd Bowles is a big part of it, both in the scheme and the technique of it, but also just the mentality they have on defense.
How important is it for them to start to break out on the road? I mean, is this a major psychological breakthrough, or you don't want to overstate it?
No, it's just one game. But I would say Carolina is one of the tougher places. I didn't even realize this until after the game.
And for Arians too, yeah.
For Arians, Bruce Arians, his only 2 playoff losses as a head coach have come in that building to the Panthers. So I think it meant a lot for him on a personal level. But they're 1-7 on the road each of the last 2 years. So to get a road win out of the gates, it had been more than a year since they won on the road. It had been more than 2 years since they gave up less than 20 points on the road. So especially for the defense has averaged 31 points a game allowed on the road for the last 2 years, which is why you're 1-7 every year. So big step there. It's just one game. They go to the Rams and the Saints for their next 2 road games, so much tougher, but a big step forward for them within one game.
Talk a little bit about Todd Bowles, of course, the former NFL coach. I mean, what's his personality like? Kind of take us into the locker room. What is it about him that is making an impact, obviously?
Yeah, he was a coordinator under Arians. He's actually known Bruce Arians since the 1980s, played for him at Temple in 1984.
Wow.
So they go way back. And Bruce has like 8 guys on the staff that either played or coached for him at Temple, where he stopped coaching in 1988. But no, so Todd Bowles, it's neat to see. You can tell he's more comfortable in this role. He's been a head coach in New York City for the last 4 years, which is a very different beast in terms of media responsibility, expectations. He'll go to a presser here and there's a half dozen people at a press conference sometimes. So
right.
I think it in terms of it just letting him go back to being a football coach, it is a simpler challenge for him. I think he very much has some autonomy on his side of the ball. I think Arians trusts him as like a 1A more than a defensive coordinator. And they've had success. I mean, that first game, I know the Niners put up 31 points, but 2 of those were pick sixes. I think the Niners had like 256 yards of total offense. Hadn't won with that few yards in like 10 years. So for 2 games at least, it's a very promising start for him.
Now, let's get into the division I want to talk about. And first of all, of course, the elephant in the room. I got to ask you about Cam Newton. I mean, what were your impressions?
Yeah, it's wild to see a game in which he was not a threat to run the ball at all. We talked all week about that. I hadn't even noticed that he had negative yards in their opener against the Rams. It's like in his entire career, 125 games, he's failed to gain yards rushing 4 times, and 2 of them are in the last 5 days. So that tells you it kind of has to be by design. Either they don't want him to or he can't. So you think about they had 3 4th and 1 plays. And again, Cam Newton's as good a short yardage player as I know in the NFL. Not running back, player. And the first time they went to him, he got stopped. And the next 2 times they didn't go to him. They stopped McCaffrey in the second one. And then you're 2 yards away from basically winning a game. They'd go ahead with 90 seconds to play.
Stunning.
And they run a fake play. It's clever, but you got a 6'6" quarterback you can go over the top with. Go ahead and do a QB sneak there if you can.
Well, and to me, it is clever, but they've shown that look before to a certain extent. And now it's getting to the point where, hey, here's a new toy. He's not new, but we've got McCaffrey, and we're going to utilize him that much more and get away from your bread and butter. My big question, though, and to me, this is it's a little bit like Todd Gurley, reminds me of it. I mean, how bad is his foot? How bad is his arm? Even though people say, well, he's still got a strong arm. and all of that. He's had a couple of surgeries now just over the last 3 years. I mean, but first of all, I want to ask you, what do you think about his foot problem? Because Cam specifically brought it up after the game. He cited the foot. I don't want to make excuses, but the foot,
And he named the two body parts we're asking about. Yeah.
Right.
So for Cam, that's taking away a bit. I mean, if you're a mobile quarterback who has a foot issue and a throwing arm issue, he threw for 333, so he clearly can throw the ball. He hit Olsen downfield. He hit Moore and Samuels at times.
He had some drops too.
Right. Oh, no. I mean, 333, I think this is the most yards he's ever thrown for in an NFL game without a touchdown. And that was the big thing, is that they got into Bucs territory 9 times and had no touchdowns to show for it. And they get 4 field goals and they lose because of it. So, yeah, Cam is – and until they win, this is going to be what people in Charlotte are talking about, is what is wrong with Cam? What are his deficiencies? They don't have a lot behind him, because if you want to rest him, now you're looking at – Kyle Allen and Will Grier as your backup quarterbacks, about as inexperienced a plan B as you have in the NFL.
Have you noticed, though, maybe it's just me, but people can't wait to bury that guy?
Yeah, ever since, it's like after the Super Bowl, when he was kind of childish afterwards, didn't want to talk afterwards. Again, as tough a moment as you're going to have as an athlete is losing a Super Bowl and having to speak to it immediately. But he's kind of been somebody who's fallen out of favor. I think you always think about those players like, does the default fan root for him to win in a game where they don't care about either team? And I think he probably doesn't. I mean, again, it's like last night. You look at the outfit afterwards, he's as flamboyant a post-game dresser as there is. You have to like the personality there. But because he's not winning,
right,
the default fan doesn't like him right now.
Right, and I think that's just a mentality that's created out of the NFL and out of that kind of football situation. That's something, it's fascinating to me, the interplay between the NBA and the NFL. You remember the David Stern, and he wanted to keep it buttoned down. He wanted to have the dress code, right? And the players are broken out of that in the NBA. And so now you've got Cam Newton, and I know people are going to be talking about his hair, talking about his
scarf.
Look. It's kind of, yeah. What's the story? I mean, is there an explanation? Is that a style of fashion that's out there? And the hair, right? Did you ask around about that at all?
No, it was like we only see him twice a year, so it's like the novelty is like, what will Cam wear? We actually walked back up into the press box after the Bucs locker room, and Cam was on the podium. So we're watching on the kind of the closed circuit TV there, and you have to just watch. It's like you said, he's very much an NBA fashion guy. There's that level of I care about what I look like, and I don't care what you think I look like, which is a great combination. If that happened, I'm sure you'd get desensitized to it, and you'd just, oh, hey, Cam, how are you? But when you see it once or twice a year, it's fun all by itself. So like I said, you wish he could have the same success he had maybe 3 years ago and before that, where he's an MVP. He's just not there right now.
So dare I say that the Buccaneers could compete now in this division? I mean, what do you feel like is there going to be their spot there? I mean, it's overreaction day after, I know, but what do you think about the division?
Yeah, I felt like I went into this thinking it's still very much the Saints' division to lose. And to see, I mean, Falcons struggled badly offensively in their first game. And Minnesota's a good team, don't get me wrong. So I do think there's at least a battle for second. And if the Saints show any kind of mortality at all, what's tricky for the Bucs is they have 3 division games in the first 6. Week 5, they're at New Orleans. Week 6, they're facing Carolina in London. So half of your division schedule is going to be done 6 weeks into the season. Even if you're just 2-1 in those games, you suddenly have a road win in the division, which are not easy to come by. I still think of them as a middle of the road team. But again, if the rest of the division is kind of coming down a little bit and they can rise, you can make up a lot of ground quickly.
Last thing for you, the defense. I mean, you talked about middle of the road, average. Is there anything on this Bucs team that potentially by the end of the year won't be average, that will break out?
Yeah, I mean, offensively, they had the number 1 passing offense in the NFL last year, at least in terms of yardage, just because they were behind so much. They threw so much. So their passing game has not been good at all. Chris Godwin is the only guy who's really made plays offensively. They have not gotten Mike Evans involved. O.J. Howard has been completely missing. So they can click at a much better level offensively than they have as a one-on-one team right now. Shaq Barrett had 3 sacks last night. There's no telling if that's completely an anomaly. He had 3 sacks all of last year in an entire season with the Broncos. So filling that void where Jason Pierre-Paul is not right now would be a huge plus for this defense. In terms of where they're above average as a team for a season, you'd think it comes back to that passing game, but we haven't seen it so far.
And you've got the quarterback whisperer, the so-called Bruce Arians. Are you going to London, by the way?
I am looking forward to it. First time for me, so very excited.
Man, that's going to be awesome. I wish I could just stow away in your luggage.
Yeah,
I
get really LA, cool. Seattle, and London in a span of like 5 weeks.
Damn, that's freaking awesome. And Hillsborough County.
And of course, come here in Tampa.
You got it. Greg, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
That was great. Greg Allman, Tampa Bay Buccaneers beat writer. Interesting team. Interesting division. I think when you try where these teams are, you've got some big names. Cam division. You got Matt Ryan, the somewhat underachieving, well, not somewhat, but the underachieving Falcons. You've got Drew Brees with the Saints. And we're all saying to ourselves, how much longer is this guy going to last? Of course, and Drew Brees struggled down the stretch last year, late in the season, perhaps showing some age for the first time that anybody can remember. So you have that dynamic of Atlanta. You've got New Orleans with a quarterback situation. And then you've got Carolina with Cam Newton. And we just discussed him. And nobody really knows what to think about Cam Newton. So we're going to be visiting here, coming up with Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman. He is the guy who has Texas football and Texas basketball locked down. And why don't we bring him up, guys? Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman. And I know there's a lot of people out there that, well, more than likely want to hear us talk about the situation with the locker room. And Brian, how you doing?
Hey, Brooks, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I can't thank you enough. You cover the Texas Longhorn beat at the Austin American-Statesman, and you have actually done the work, and you've gone behind the scenes.
Yes.
And you have, I mean, theoretically, the FOIA, you would think, kind of settles. Of course, it doesn't settle the matter, and it never will. It literally never will, because college football is irrational by its nature. That's why we love it. But describe the FOI thing that you were able to get from the University of Texas in relation to the LSU locker room.
Well, I really sort of sent that request in on a lark, quite frankly. I said I had heard that there was an internal report out there, and almost for my own personal comedy, I said, let's just send in an FOI. Let's just see what happens. And that was about 11 o'clock yesterday, and Texas typically takes 10 calendar days, 10 full days to fulfill any FOI request.
Right? That's remarkably fast, by the way.
Unbelievably fast. 3 hours later, boom, in my inbox lands an Excel spreadsheet with analysis, analytics. We've got graphs. We've got charts. It was amazing. The bottom line is, according to the university's Excel spreadsheet, that the locker room was 69 to 72 degrees all afternoon at Roll Memorial.
Now, I've dealt with FOIAs my whole career covering college football with the Ohio States and the Oregons of the world. And I mean, 10 days to fulfill a request, that's the fastest I've ever heard. And
right.
What was remarkable about it, and maybe when I say this, you're going to say, don't shoot the messenger. And of course, I am shooting the messenger here, but this is the first FOIA I've seen without a redaction on it, I might add. And you got it back in 3 hours. So I'm not saying it's of course, I'm sure it is accurate, but it's a remarkable situation. And it's incredible how fast it just goes to show you, though. It's to me, something maybe you want to keep in your back pocket as precedent for the future, right?
Well,
down the line, say, hey, guys, you did it this fast this time. What about now?
Exactly. Well, so what I did was, after I got that, called up to the office and talked to some people in the tower. And there's a couple things here. Number one is that Texas wants this story to go away because they think it's frivolous, right? Texas people are literally walking right up to the line of calling Ed Orgeron a liar and they don't want to step across that line, right? For professional reasons. That's number one. Number two is that, Texas people think, why didn't Coach O just say, hey, look, we had some cramping issues. We should have drank a little more water, but we got the W. And that
Willie Taggart.
That's all you got to say.
But you don't want to be associated with Willie Taggart, right?
Right, exactly. Just, hey, we need to drink a little more water. Our guys may or may not have been in shape, and we'll get that fixed, and you move on to the next game. But instead, it's now today's what, day 5, day 6 actually of Swampgate, and so that's
Swampgate.
I love it.
Swampgate. Now wait a minute, is that a Texas reference to Louisiana?
Well, no, it's just. Well, I guess maybe it is. That's what some.
Are you calling Ed Orgeron like a member of the Swamp People cast? Is that what you're suggesting? Because by the way, I am.
What's so funny?
He'd be perfect for that show.
What's so funny is I had Florida people coming at me on Twitter going, hey, we're the Swamp. We do the insults around here, people. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. It's Florida. Right, your corner. So nonetheless, the thing about Brooks, I'll tell you this, is that it number one is that for us, for the Horn, for those of us covering Texas, it's Rice Week. So this is a great distraction from that. But number two is that, it was a great environment. It was an awesome game. LSU was the winner. Kudos to them. And it's just, I don't like the fact that this is what we're talking about after what was a pretty awesome game, I thought, at the stadium.
Yeah, and it's one of the more bizarre situations I can remember, because I have never seen, with the exception of Texas in the way that they've handled it, more parsing and more hedging, and sometimes deliberate, sometimes unwitting, not only by people at LSU, perhaps, and Skip Holtz at Louisiana Tech, perhaps. It certainly appears that way. And I might add the media, because I think it's kind of a perfect storm where your reporting is a little bit of an outlier. But then again, I bring up, wow, it's not redacted. Wow, they got it. So you have this ridiculously fast, strange request that is fulfilled in what you said, 3 hours. So that might, hurt a little bit of the credibility. I'm not doubting that it is the real thing, but I think the media played a role in the way that it reported Coach Orgeron's remarks, because at one point he said, we had air, right? We had air, and we brought in some blowers. So it sounds like they had air. It wasn't that great. They brought in blowers just in case. But in the same explanation, he starts it off by saying Louisiana Tech did not have air. And I understand he didn't talk to Skip Holtz. He talked to somebody on the staff. That's the other thing. We don't know who he talked to.
Right.
But everybody's leaning on the fact he didn't talk to Skip Holtz. So you have that side of it. And you have, if you look at 24/7, and I'm not singling them out because I'm kind of in the same boat, but in the way that one article, not by Chip Brown, another article was positioned the way he said the way we had air. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused, but there was an article on 24/7 Sports that portrayed it as if Coach Orgeron indicated there was no air conditioning. And I wish I could put it up on the screen so we could look at it. And then you had reports coming out, of course, from the Baton Rouge Advocate, in which the headline was, you may remember, Brian, Orgeron confirms no air conditioning. Well, he never
said that. Exactly.
Right.
He never.
So that's what I mean. It took me 5 minutes to say nothing.
Right. And that's the thing, is that I went back and listened to his press conference. He never said there was no air conditioning. And that's the thing. And so,
but now I just read a report out of USA Today where I think it's like a different quote that just came out this morning, where I know you're shaking your head, but I have to go back and look at it. But he literally said there was no air conditioning. I think what he said was, Coach O said, we brought air conditioning with us.
Okay.
That's kind of okay. Is that the blower, or is that a wall unit, or what does that mean? Right. So,
well, look, all I know is that, the stadium was built in 1924, and the visiting team's locker room's air conditioner was not an issue until Saturday night. right? So take from that what you will. I'll tell you what, this in terms of craziness, I was thinking about it. The only thing that I have ever seen in person that matches this is 2002. I was covering Texas Tech and A&M. Tech wins a big game. The fans come on the field in Lubbock. They tear down the goalposts, and they shove the goalposts in the A&M section, right? And that was the game where you had Governor Rick Perry's chief of staff, he got hit in the head, with somebody swinging binoculars in him, and, he was bloody and stuff. And it was Aggies punching Aggies, right?
Right.
So
right.
That was one of the greatest other crazy moments that we've had. That was back, early Big 12 days, but still that and this are the only two that in terms of sheer craziness.
Now, I do want to establish one thing, and it's a question for you. But the whole issue of the air conditioning and how cool it was, the ability to get ready for a game and you're not already in the heat, was the cramping situation. It was the genesis, was the germ of this whole story.
Correct.
The fact that LSU was pushing back on the possibility that its players were faking cramps on the field during the game. Is this the germ of it all?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Texas people, they're very quiet about this, but they absolutely believe that some of those cramps were fake, right? Because it just so happened that they started cramping up when Texas was in the middle of a 19-play touchdown drive in the third quarter where they were starting to get the momentum, right?
Right.
And if you notice that no LSU offensive players had problems and 0 Texas players had problems. So they find it a little too convenient that LSU's defense has to lay down on the field 5 different times on that drive. When, if you look at the end of the game, they didn't do that. And when it was crunch time in the fourth quarter, nobody was laying down at that point.
It's interesting, though, that Orgeron did mention, I think he mentioned 85 plays, he mentioned 93 plays in the context of the cramping. So to an extent, he did kind of, address the issue.
Mm-hmm.
I looking back on it now, I mean, it's like what you said, just sit down. Did you have air conditioning or not?
Right.
Because now we're throwing around this guy lied. Skip Holtz wakes up. Like, Skip Holtz doesn't have enough problems in his life.
A bomb went off right in his front yard. He didn't even do anything.
Right.
So what did I do?
Boy, is that guy, would he be a great lawyer, though, by the way, with that response?
Absolutely.
That is the most
response.
Oh, my God, what a response. So we're visiting with Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman, and let's talk some football. Let's talk about Texas. I mean, what were your impressions of Texas in that game against LSU?
Well, I mean, I definitely thought that Texas played to what I definitely expected them to do, right? I mean, look, there's no doubt that LSU thought they were going to come to Austin, roll in there, and steamroll Texas. There's just no doubt about that. The way that was their pregame talk, that was their pregame feel. They really thought they was going to be a cakewalk, and they got smashed in the mouth. And what I would say to that is that if you're an LSU fan and you didn't, and you really thought it was going to be easy, then you didn't watch the Sugar Bowl over Georgia.
Now, is that based on Texas's personnel? Based on why would LSU take that approach? And of course, Georgia laid down or whatever.
Sure.
Why would LSU take that approach?
Well, because it's the Big 12, and the whole SEC, SEC. It just means more BS, right? I mean, that's all part of that. So, but the physical nature was there. Ellinger was dealing. I mean, look, if Texas gets a touchdown in one of those first 2 opportunities on the goal line in the first quarter, I think it's a totally different game, because at that point, Texas would have been up 7-3. LSU would have been rocked back on their heels. The stadium's going. It's a different feel at that point. Instead, they go in the locker room down 20-7, and it was like, oh God, they're about to get killed, right? But the fact that they just kept storming back, and answering every punch. I mean, it really was 2 heavyweights going at it. And, LSU, definitely kudos to them, because Joe Burrow, I thought, was amazing. He deserves all the kudos that he got after the game. 3 different receivers with 100 yards each, a first in LSU history. I will be stunned if LSU is not in the SEC title mix, when this is all said and done.
Of course, that's going to go through Tuscaloosa as far as LSU is concerned. That's the thing. I mean, I think we're looking at the possibility of 3 teams from the SEC in the college football playoff. What's interesting to me is Texas theoretically could still be a contender, especially depending on what happens. At least Texas has an OU,
right?
A Pac-12 situation. You don't have two teams like that. But what do you think about Texas? Do you think this is a team that still could be in the hunt for the college football playoff?
Well, I definitely think that mathematically, schematically, whatever word you want to use, they can absolutely climb back into the mix. Because in theory, they're probably going to play OU twice. If you assume that Texas is going to do really well this year, well, that means probably playing the Sooners twice, one in Dallas and one in Arlington at the end, which I think if you're the Big 12, having that game be a sort of de facto CFP quarterfinal game is your best scenario as a league, right? So if you do that, Iowa State's going to get better, I think. Oklahoma State is a team that's always going to be solid. There's a lot of good teams in the Big 12 where you can get wins and pump up your ratings. And if you beat OU twice, in my opinion, if you win the Big 12 with what would it be? I guess it'd be a 12-1 record. You should be in the CFP mix very heavily.
I mean, that's a larger issue, and I think it's an inevitability. But the thing about the college football playoff, just as an aside, is we went without a playoff, and we had all these ridiculous system things that we did with the BCS over the years.
Right.
But what it comes down to is ESPN's John Skipper at the time, the former president, decided to write a check.
Right.
For the college football playoff. That's what it took, period. Now I think what you've got representatives from the conferences who are not participating, from the Big 10 primarily, and the Big 12, I know. They're lobbying for it. But at the end of the day, if you don't have that person to write the check, now I think Jimmy Pitaro might be the guy to write the check. I think we're now in a position, when you look at television, you look at, like, let's just say Fox, they're devoting their primetime lineup that used to be scripted television now to live sports. This is a different time, a different place that we're in. Go ahead.
Well, and only too, because sports will forever be the only thing that you can't really DVR. Right. So it's going to have the most eyeballs at all times. Right.
Right.
I mean, you can throw on as many episodes of CSI as you want, but an Alabama Auburn game is going to kill it for CBS. Right. So for me, that's the real issue, is that how do these leagues, how does the CFP, how do they capitalize on the most eyeballs when you've got cord cutting going galore? I just became a cord cutter myself. Right.
Right.
And so
how's that going, by the way?
It's spotty.
You know what happens? You cut the cord and you end up spending more money.
Well,
and you're getting all these different
things. How everything is $10 a month, and you don't think about it. Next thing you know, you spend $200.
Right. And now we've got, we don't even have Disney Plus yet.
That's right.
Exactly. We've got this whole new wave coming.
Exactly. So, here in our kind of geographic footprint, we're getting hammered with ESPN Plus ads with miles to go, watching Hard Knocks with Les Miles, right?
Oh my God.
Which I got to tell you, it's funny. I've seen a couple of them. It's not terrible. It's not terrible, but I don't know if it's going to generate massive subscriptions for ESPN.
Well, listen, I mean, the thing about it, and you remember Les and his medieval Stone Age offense at LSU, and that's predicated, and that's, I think, where we are in college football. It really is an arms race in terms of talent. I don't want to denigrate Nick Saban, but I guess I will. Nick Saban is a great recruiter, right? There's nothing artful about what he's doing. And I think Dabo Swinney, you could certainly make the same argument. I mean, look at Trevor Lawrence this year. He's not what we saw him, that he was last year. I'm not saying that's going to continue. But I think that's LSU is a function of that. And it was a function of that when Les Miles was there, and he was a great recruiter, incredible charisma, and eventually his crappy offense caught up to him. Right. And now you go to Kansas, which is arguably among the FBS schools, the hardest school among the Power 5 conferences. You can make the argument that it might be the hardest school to recruit to. I mean, how do you think that's going to play out at Kansas? You're in the league.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But the thing about it, though, is that they have won in the past. They have been to an Orange Bowl with
Texas knows that.
Yeah, they won with Genius. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not like it's not undoable there.
Right.
I honestly, the school that I really fear out of the Big 12 now is, in terms of going downhill, is K-State, right? I mean, because with Snyder gone. And we saw what happened when Snyder left the first time. It was a disaster, right? And so they get him back, and they can't put him in some cryo chamber and keep him around, to be 200 years, right? Can't do that.
He may have been in a cryo chamber the last 3 years. No telling.
Absolutely, right?
The way he is.
And the other school that that I don't know about, I have a big question mark on my head, is West Virginia, because even though Dana didn't want to be there and they kind of grew tired of him, I mean, that's a tough road to hoe. It's geographically it's hard. To get the talent to compete with the Big 12 is hard. I don't know how Brown's going to do there.
Well, in terms of K-State, I think they got the right guy this time.
Right.
I think, yeah, because that guy was at South Dakota, did a great job recruiting and scared teams every year, beat teams every year that were Power 5 conference teams. So if there's ever going to be a guy, I think, who might be able to continue what they've done that Snyder has created, I think it's him. My attitude about West Virginia is it just is not going to work in the Big 12. It just can't work under the present situation. Can it? I mean, is there a possibility that they're not going to be in the Big? I mean, it's hard to imagine, but the Big 12 is also. I'm asking you a question, then I'm answering a question, and I go on to another question without letting you answer the question. But what do you think the future is for West Virginia in the Big 12?
Well, I think at some point West Virginia will lead. I really do think they will lead the league, and I think it'll all coincide with the TV contracts expiring, in the middle of the next decade. And I think there's going to be a giant reshuffle of everything, right? My thing about West Virginia is that, look, the Big 12, if they could do it over again, they would take Louisville, right? If we could rewind the clock and do it all over again, they absolutely would grab Louisville, and they would not take West Virginia. And I think West Virginia would say, hey, let's study the map this time before we go jumping into a new league. Because, I mean, there were complaints in year one about, the geography and the flights and all this other stuff, because that's what people don't think about, bro. They don't think about putting your volleyball team on a flight from Morgantown to Lubbock. They don't think about the soccer team flying to all these across country and all these schools. That's why Texas ultimately backed out of the Pac-12, right? It was this idea of, do we really want to put the golf team on a flight to Seattle? And do we really want to put our smaller teams on these flights? So I really do think that we will see in our lifetime very soon. I think we're going to see 4 super conferences of 16 teams each. And I think we're going to get to the 64 team model. And that is what, the national championship pool will ultimately come from.
And it'll be sooner than later. We're visiting with Brian Davis of the Austin American Statesman. And you brought up a really interesting point about the Pac-12, the Pacific Coast Conference, and welding those two conferences together. And I think the biggest thing in this whole discussion is that the Big 12, the Longhorn Network precluded the Big 12 network. Let's face it, that's what happened. And the Pac-12 was completely mismanaged by Larry Scott. They could have gotten that deal. And now I don't think ESPN's in a big hurry, to do a Big 12 network. Why would they be? I think when you look at a West Virginia, you're trying to figure out what's going to happen. Is it going to happen sooner or later? The fact that West Virginia doesn't have that kind of big money coming out of the SEC, or now the ACC with the ACC network, or the Big Ten, I think they're saying to themselves, what the hell? Why are we doing this? We're not getting the largesse because, the Longhorn Network precluded that. So what's the status of the Longhorn Network? Where are we, and how is Texas doing with it?
Well, the one thing about Texas, from Texas's standpoint, they're not going to give up a $15 million check that comes every year. Right. They're just not going to do that. I have wondered if ESPN.
Are we looking at an independent situation then?
No, I don't think Texas will ever go independent. I really don't. I do believe that they would stay in the conference. I have long wondered, why doesn't ESPN just come up with a big number and say, hey, Texas, we want to buy our way out of this deal, whether it's $100 million or $150 million, whatever, right? Because LHN has been so detrimental to this league. It's
Well, Texas A&M left because of it.
Yeah, Texas A&M
and Nebraska, Missouri. They left the Longhorn Network, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now what you have is all these other schools fighting to get their product on a new subscriber service with ESPN Plus. I mean, Oklahoma made out okay. They have their third tier rights are now with Fox, and that's worked out good for them. But Iowa State, Kansas, K-State, that they had nothing for the longest time. And so I think that what you're going to continue to hear is that the Big 12 officials are going to crow about, well, now we have ESPN Plus. And yeah, that's true.
So does the AAC, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I do wonder if the subscriber model is better in the long run. Like, for example, if you're a parent of a soccer player, would you just pay $5.99 to watch your team's soccer matches on ESPN Plus? Or do you want to have to get ACC Network or SEC Network, and maybe some of the games are on and some aren't? I don't know what the right answer is. But that's what I think Big 12 officials are going to start crowing about is, hey, you can watch every Iowa State volleyball match you want, right? Okay, great. That doesn't move the needle in a giant way financially, though.
What do you think about one of the more complicated things, I think, going on in college football, trying to understand it from the outside, is Texas not playing Texas A&M.
Ugh.
It's very complicated and hard to figure out.
That's very complicated. Because you have
younger people, older people, alums, outsiders. Everybody has a different opinion.
I think everybody needs all the olds are going to have to die before this really everybody wakes up and says, "Oh, right. What are we doing here?" I mean, at this point, it's about pride. It's about egos involved on both sides. Pride and egos. That's the downfall.
But not the students. But this is not the students.
No, right. These are for the people that run the university. Governor Greg Abbott, who is a Texas person, tried to force the issue and get both sides to come to the table. Didn't work out. Jimbo Fisher now at A&M. His kind of standard line is, well, if it benefits A&M, we'll do it, which is code for until the political winds change, we're not going to do it, right? But my thing has been this, why can't they play each other in every single sport? Because they used to sell that as a sponsorship, right? The State Farm Showdown. Why can't they play each other in every sport except football? Then you can have somewhat of the rivalry going. And I mean, it only makes sense they're 2 hours apart.
Well, let me ask you a question. And I think if you talk to an A&M person who's not in school, who's, let's say, over the age of 35, 40, if you ask them, why aren't you guys playing? Aren't they going to say the Longhorn Network?
Right, they will.
That's it. That's the answer.
And they're going to say, well, DeLoss told us to get off, and we did. Okay, fine. And Lofton was all, Lofton says, fine, we'll take our ball and we'll leave. And he called up Slive and the 100-year decision and all that stuff, right? But look, I will say this. I really do think that there will come a day where Texas A&M and Texas both are going to need that game for their ticket prices, for their season ticket package. And I have long said, if I'm A&M, who only has 8 conference games and 4 nobodies on your schedule, why not play that game and play it the year opposite you have Alabama at home, so that every year as an A&M fan, that either Alabama or Texas is coming to Kyle Field, right? Problem is, though, on the Texas side, they're now saying, well, do we want to go to College Station for our big game, or do we want to go to Baton Rouge, or do we want to go to Columbus, Ohio, or do we want to go to Tuscaloosa?
What about a neutral site game? Go to Houston or Dallas or whatever.
Now, see, why do you want to use common sense in all this? Why would you use common sense in any of this?
We know what's going to happen if they want to play that game in Houston. The Texas people are going to object. And we got to have it in Dallas. That Dallas is the natural thing, right?
Well, like I said, you're using logic to an illogical situation.
Right. Well, and I think it's important for us to kind of explain things. When I say they're not playing because of the Longhorn Network, and maybe, I don't know, you may have a different definition or description of this. My perception is that once Texas decided in the Big 12, all right, you've got the SEC Network creating all this revenue. Mm-hmm. You've got now the ACC Network and the Big Ten Network. That means huge money for the recruiting budget, facilities, all that. And now Texas A&M now is part of that in the SEC, Whereas had they stayed in the Big 12, they would not be part of that. There's no Big 12 network. And the reason there's no Big 12 network is the Longhorn Network.
Correct.
Right. And so Texas A&M is saying, for all we know, for all we care, we would have stayed in the Big 12 had it not been for Texas. They created this situation. At the time, DeLoss Dodd said, kiss off.
That's
right?
absolutely.
So now we go over to the SEC. Right. And now we go into the SEC and we're making all this money. We're developing this cool rivalry, which is a good rivalry with LSU. We've got a partner school over there in a pretty good division. You know, what do we have to gain now in playing? But it's great for the sport. It's great for the country. You know, I just remember that what was it, the day after Thanksgiving for years, or Thanksgiving when they played it, best little whorehouse in Texas. Right. I mean, that whole thing, it's embedded into the culture. But is that what's going on here? That what kind of way I described it, or what else?
You hit the nail exactly on the head. Texas A&M would not be getting the same sort of TV revenue money out of their third tier package on their own in the Big 12 as they are now getting from the SEC. So financially,
and that means facilities, that means recruiting budget, that means facilities, significant money.
Absolutely.
That you don't get if you're in the Big 12.
Absolutely. Financially speaking, A&M's decision to walk to the SEC was a genius move, financially speaking, right? And I think part of the problem is people like you and me and a lot of traditionalists. I mean, we want to see stuff continue. I get it. Time marches on, but there are some things that are bigger.
But that's college football. I mean, that's why college football is what it is.
See, because here's the thing too. Playing Oklahoma, Texas is going to play Oklahoma no matter what, right? But playing A&M, that's you arguing with your coworkers. That's you arguing with family members. That's what the sport is all about, right? That's what the sport is all about. The rivalries and the everything. That's what makes the sport great. And to sort of deny all of us that, I personally think is wrong. But you know, whatever.
Well, we're talking to Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman, and of course he covers the Texas Longhorns beat. And I think that what's really concerning to me is more than anything, and this is where the alums and the old-time fans need to wake up, is there's been surveys done. I know there's been surveys done of citizens of the state of Texas, but also, more importantly, I think students at these two institutions, and the students are like, play the game. I mean, isn't that what we're hearing?
And the real reality is that they don't really understand why it stopped, right? And to be honest, they don't care, right?
And what I'm telling you, I think a lot of older fans don't understand either. They're just following the lead of a lot of people.
Absolutely. And so I really do think it's a little bit depressing now that we're going to have an entire generation of Texas and A&M students who didn't really get to enjoy all that. And, you know, that's what going to college is all about, you know, playing your rival and football Saturdays and the whole 9 yards.
Does it disconnect the state at all? I mean, I don't know, but give me a picture of the geography. I mean, you're talking about Houston, you're talking about Austin, you're talking about Dallas. Does that disconnect the Houston area perhaps from the Austin area or Dallas?
I can tell you this, and this is just, now granted, I'm admitting up front that I live in Austin, but A&M, it's almost like they might as well be in the Eastern time zone as it is, because that's where all their opponents are, and it's almost like, you know, that they were cut off and shipped off to another time zone because, you know, and when you couple who they play with, they have super tight media restrictions now. It's very hard to go interview their players. And so, you know, I know that the Dallas media market has pulled back on what they want to do with A&M. I know the Austin market has.
Very
and it's just because if you make it hard to cover your program, people aren't going to want to do it, especially in this age of where journalism is at now. You really need to open your doors, in my mind.
But you know, that's not where their money's coming from.
Exactly. That's not where it's coming from. And so it's all relative now to where they're getting, where A&M and all these other schools are getting their attention. Look, I know I'm probably going to get killed for saying that, but that really is, that's what the truth is right now, how things are perceived.
Well, I'll guarantee you A&M fans are looking at this just saying, Longhorn Network, we wanted to play, and now you want us to come back. And now you're in the Big 12. You need us because your schedule is crap. So if you want to make the college football playoff, you want to move up those rankings, you need big wins over big opponents. Why should we do that? What do we have to gain by beating Texas necessarily?
Well, that's the thing, too. If Texas fans are truly being honest, their home schedule sucks. I mean, it just does. I mean, Kansas and Kansas State are coming here this year. Whoop-de-doo. Tickets are going to be giveaways, right? So you can schedule a big game every year, but Herman says it multiple times. He'll say our biggest game is away from campus, and he's right. It's in Dallas at the Cotton Bowl. So, I don't know. I don't know how to fix this. Obviously, no one does.
Yeah.
But I'm of the very strong opinion that both these schools should play. I think both these schools should play it for their strength of schedule, for their season ticket price, and it makes too much sense. So that's why they don't do it.
At some point, what we got to do is, because we can put up 3 people on the screen, we might maybe have you back and maybe have somebody who's covering A&M.
Sure,
have a discussion about it. And because I think that dialogue is what's going to help to change it. I think ultimately it gets changed in places like Bristol, Connecticut, and on Pico Boulevard on the Fox lot, where the checks are going to be written and the influence is affected.
Well,
but I think having a roundtable discussion and keeping this alive is really important.
No, I 100% agree with that. This discussion has to keep going because A&M and Texas people both blow people like me up whenever we do talk about this. Oh, the rivalry's dead. Quit talking about it. No, I think you have to keep talking about it to keep it going. Like a couple years ago, when Texas went, they were 6-6. They were going to the Texas Bowl. There was a big talk about, is A&M going to meet Texas in the Texas Bowl in Houston? But both schools now, they don't want to restart this thing until it's either in the CFP or it's the start of an annual game, because it's like, well, we got
and we got to run. I'm not going to keep you all day.
Everybody happy.
But let me tell you, here's the thing: for A&M fans, for Texas fans, especially A&M fans, because they tend to trend towards we don't care.
Right.
Look, it's bigger than you. It's bigger than Jimbo. It's bigger than what's happening right now with the program. It's bigger than the presidents of the schools. It's bigger than the governor and the legislature, in my opinion. I mean, I'm taking getting on my high horse. I guess I am.
Right.
But it's bigger, and I'm a disinterested third party, and I'm really into it. And so I think this discussion is a big part of keeping this thing going, and maybe we'll revisit this at some point. I can't thank you enough, Brian, for taking the time.
You bet, absolutely.
Awesome. That's Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman. Coming up, we're going to talk to Steve Berkowitz of USA Today about a really hot subject, and I'm glad I got to talk to Brian about A&M in Texas. And I think that's something that we need to talk about a little bit more to fundamentally understand why things are the way they are. Why is A&M in the SEC? Because it's very clear. And I kind of laid it out, fumbled around a little bit. But the Longhorn Network is the reason. You've got the SEC network. You got the Big Ten networks. You got the ACC network. Those propositions financially are an enormous financial benefit to the football programs in those conferences. So if you're Vanderbilt in the SEC, because of the SEC network, and to an extent because of the play-by-play broadcast rights agreement with CBS, which is going to be coming up for bid, and that's going to be a monster deal. If you're Vanderbilt, that means everything to your recruiting budget. And so the Longhorn Network, in creating that individual network, Texas froze all the Big 12 schools out. ESPN, of course, enabled it. But when they created the Longhorn Network, there's no Big 12 network. A&M's on the outside looking in, and now they're not going to get the same sort of financial largesse that even a Vanderbilt's going to get in the SEC network. So that's why A&M went to the SEC, and that's why Nebraska went to the Big Ten. That's why Missouri went to the SEC. That's the answer. And the Longhorn Network is a big reason why Texas A&M doesn't want to play Texas. That's just a fact. And there's other things that go into it. But I want to now go out and talk to Steve Berkowitz of USA Today, who is nice. All right, are we back? Can you hear me, Steve?
I can now.
That was my bad. I can't thank you enough for dropping in. Thank you.
Sure. No, thanks a lot for having me on.
That's Steve Berkowitz of USA Today, and we're going to talk about SB 206. And Steve, run down what exactly is SB 206.
Sure. It's a bill in the California legislature that's now passed the legislature and gone on to the governor. And it would allow college athletes in the state to make money off their name, image, and likeness in ways that are not currently allowed by the NCAA's rules.
This is really fascinating to me. It's a little analogous, I think, to the college football playoff, because there was this eternal debate for literally over 100 years about compensating players. And then about having a college football playoff. And then all of a sudden, John Skipper wakes up one morning and decides to write a check. And suddenly we have a college football playoff after 100 years. And it's a little bit similar here. Well, you're telling me that the California Assembly, just a couple of guys, a couple of legislatures now, they are on the verge of this fundamental sea change, this slippery slope. I mean, is it that big?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. First of all, the thing to remember is that this wouldn't go into effect until January of 2023. So there's a ways for that to go on. And the NCAA is, examining the issue of name, image, and likeness, whether or not there'll be some proposals that, come anywhere close to what California is talking about allowing certainly remains to be seen. And if the governor signs this into law, I would expect that there would be a legal challenge to it under any number of potential approaches. So, I mean, we're a ways from seeing from how it would all work out. But yeah, I mean, if it goes into effect as it is set up, yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
What's fascinating to me is the defense of the NCAA. They have these convoluted defenses that they always use when they're facing this compensation issue. And what I was reading here and some of your reporting was the indication is the whole basis of not allowing athletes to benefit from their likenesses and names financially is that it would create an unfair competitive advantage. Not that it's immoral, to not compensate football players who are playing a life-endangering sport, none of whom have guaranteed health care in writing, having hundreds of millions of dollars essentially stolen from them. That's not the issue. It's that the University of Alabama, well, they'll be at an unfair disadvantage. Is that the correct read on some of their justification for pushing back on it?
That's some of it, but I mean, I do think that there is this sense within the NCAA, at least again, the prevailing issue for them is that in their mind, athletes, college sports ought to be amateur as the NCAA defines amateur. And NCAA feels that it is entitled to the latitude to make that determination. They argue that legally they should be allowed to make that determination, that it shouldn't be imposed upon them by the courts or by anyone else. And their argument in the specific instance here has to do with, ironically, actually, if you think about it, that it's a violation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, that the prospect of a California law making this determination runs counter to what the Constitution says, which is that only Congress can make laws having to do with how interstate commerce works. So, I think it's sort of interesting that they would go that route. I mean, there are other potential legal arguments that can be made as well against it, but it's not. But again, the basic issue for the NCAA is that it ought to be amateur sport as they define it.
Right. When you bring up interstate commerce, that's a fascinating situation because I know at least one state right now, the North Carolina legislature is contemplating a very similar bill. So you would imagine if it appears that this may actually go into effect in the state of California, forget about North Carolina. You're going to have a lot of states that are going to mobilize overnight, like Alabama.
Well,
and so if that happens, wouldn't that preclude that whole NCAA defense?
Yes, that would have an impact, and for sure. And like just today, there's reporting out of South Carolina that the legislators in the state of South Carolina are planning to introduce a similar bill in that state. And there are pieces of legislation that either were pending or will be pending in Washington and in Colorado. I mean, not every state legislature operates basically on essentially a full-time basis the way California does. California is in business, pretty much all the time. They'll have a recess coming up here in mid-September that'll go through January. But a lot of states' legislative sessions are much smaller in length, and so how this will work out over time remains to be seen. But yeah, I mean, if you have and this is part of what the argument was among legislators in California who were backing this bill, that they want California to take the lead in the hope that other states will react the same way. And California has a pretty long history of doing these kinds of things on sort of legal issues that they feel strongly about in the state that have nothing to do with what's going on elsewhere. And they do set national policy simply because of the size of the California economy. And the greatest example of that is the car auto emission standards that are much more stringent in California than they are in other parts of the country. And that helps drive stuff within the auto industry. So, the legislators there understand what they potentially are able to help promote across the country.
So as a practical matter, what we're describing, I mean, this has to be, if you're a college football fan, again, you're talking about over 100 years of a model, just like the playoff thing that we never had. And then overnight, wait a minute, how can it be that easy? But potentially, it seems like it could be that easy. But as a practical matter, what does this mean for a football player at UCLA? What can he do?
Well, right now, nothing. It has no practical impact for player
for a while
in California. I mean, we're again that the law wouldn't take effect until 2023. So right now, there's no impact. There's potentially impact in how this might affect some politics and recruiting. I mean, schools in California might be able, since you build recruiting classes years in advance, schools in California might be able to say, hey, come here, this is going to happen. Schools in the state of California might say, hey, that's going to happen in California, and that's going to run them into big trouble with the NCAA. And why would you want to deal with that? So the recruiting aspect of it could go both ways. But
what about now when it goes into effect?
I'm sorry?
In 2023. When it goes into effect in 2023,
right.
What would happen for an athlete? What would that opportunity represent?
It's really hard to say. I mean, it's hard to know whether or not, how prominent of a player you would need to be to draw what kind of potential endorsement deal. I mean, one of the things that they added to the bill as it was going through the legislature was a provision that would not allow an athlete, for example, who wants to make a deal with Nike to go play at UCLA, which wears Under Armour stuff, and that he could play for UCLA while wearing Nike shoes. So that's in the bill. And that's in the bill.
Yes. That's not the NCAA pushing back.
Correct.
Right?
I mean, it wouldn't preclude, right? It wouldn't preclude Nike from making a deal with an athlete to wear Nike stuff in non-team related activities. So if Nike wants to make a deal with a player in the hopes of getting in with that player, and the player agrees to wear Nike stuff when he's walking around campus, then that's, that would be allowed. But it's hard to know, at UCLA in the Los Angeles market, is there going to be, for example, a car dealer who thinks it's of any use to make an endorsement arrangement with a UCLA football player? Is there a restaurant in Westwood who thinks it would be worthwhile making an arrangement with a football player or a basketball player? It's really hard to tell how some of that stuff would play out. Whereas, for example, in Alabama, I think it's not inconceivable that players on the football team who might have, less prominence in a major metropolitan market, but are prominent and well known in a smaller marketplace, that there might be more opportunities for those guys
across the roster.
Yeah. And in non-revenue sports, I mean, as a, for instance,
right.
When Missy Franklin was swimming at Cal, she had to leave a lot of money on the table with a swimsuit company or whatever that didn't necessarily, not all of the schools have arrangements with all forms of swimwear providers. And so there would have been opportunities potentially for Olympic athletes or for athletes in those sports to do some business as well. And in the Pac-12, those sports are a big deal.
What's interesting to me is the bizarre nature of what we're describing, and it really is the Wild West. And the reason all of this exists is because of the patented unfairness, the basic unfairness, some would say immorality, of not compensating players. What's also fascinating to me is the relationship of the NCAA to college football as opposed to college basketball. Of course, in college basketball, the NCAA still maintains full authority thanks to its ability to negotiate the broadcast rights agreements. That went out the window in the 1980s for college football. So is this a possible situation where you could have a very different application in basketball as opposed to football, Steve?
I'm not sure that the NCAA's control of the TV aspects of it necessarily have anything to do with it one way or the other. And to go back to a point that you made earlier in terms of the timing of this and how things sort of change as quickly as they potentially change. Don't forget that 10 years ago, the concept of having a scholarship that would include a stipend for cost of attendance and incidentals related to that was unheard of, unthinkable, and not even on the table. And then Ed O'Bannon and Sam Keller and their lawyers went ahead and took on the NCAA. And while I don't think that was its sole deciding factor, I think that helped accelerate what was already a movement within the Power Five schools to try to enhance the value of a scholarship for athletes. So, I think these things, these things change. And I mean, the other thing too, this is, again, it's a little bit of a personal thing for me. For the athletes, say if the athletes are not compensated, I think is not fair. I mean, the athletes are really well compensated on one level, in the sense that any person who goes to college and comes out with debt attached to going to college will tell you that college athletes are compensated. Now, are they fairly compensated? For athletes who are involved in sports that generate lots and lots of money, and where athletes are putting themselves at risk health-wise and all of those ways, that's a different conversation. But I do think it's important to note that there is compensation for the athletes, and it goes beyond the scholarships that cover cost of attendance. There are other pools of money that athletes are able to access while they're in school. Again, the question of whether or not that is a fair enough level of compensation, particularly for certain athletes, that's a different question.
Is there a prospect of the NCAA helping at some point to try to revise and craft this law within California or within some of the states or nationally? Well, for what we're talking about, the likeness and names.
I mean, the NCAA can solve the issue by liberalizing its NIL, its name, image, and likeness,
right,
in a way that will mollify lawmakers. I mean, right now, an athlete can get money for their use of name, image, and likeness under the NCAA's rules, but the athlete can't identify themselves as being an athlete with that individual school, which it tends to cut down on their market value.
Right.
Area. So if the NCAA were so inclined to liberalize rules in a way that would mollify lawmakers, then they could solve the problem on a national basis. And that was part of the reason why, again, as the bill went through the legislature, this longer lead time was built into the bill. I mean, originally, the target to have this take effect would have been, I believe, this coming January. And the author of the bill was persuaded to build in a much longer lead time to give the NCAA a chance to make some changes and for the legislature to see what the NCAA did or does.
What do you think about the threat? And there's a specific, maybe you should call it a threat, maybe you should call it something else, an assertion by Ohio State President Michael Drake that I saw in some of your reporting that if the state of California schools were to go with this, that they would no longer be able to compete for NCAA championships, which effectively you would think kind of precludes their NCAA membership.
Well, it doesn't preclude their NCAA membership in the sense that they would be able to play other schools. There have been other times in the course of the NCAA's history, going back, decades ago, where, there was a threat put on schools that if you played schools in anything, not just an NCAA championship, but that if you played schools, you would taint your school by playing a school that was operating outside of the rules like that. President Drake didn't entirely dismiss the notion of that kind of thing potentially occurring. I think that's a little bit far-fetched. But that's for sure the sort of stick that the NCAA holds here as a form of leverage with the schools in California, which is to say that any school that went ahead and did this would be precluded from playing for championships. And that potentially puts the schools in a bind and puts the Pac-12 in a bind. I mean, there's some trickle back effects here that go pretty deep. I mean, you have baseball programs in the Big West that are like that. How that would work and how it manifests itself, it remains to be seen. I mean, it creates some interesting questions for sure.
This is a little bit of an aside, but the unionization issue came up at Northwestern recently in the last few years. Is that something that you think could crop back up here in the future? And could that be the future when it comes to some sort of compensation model for college football and basketball players?
I think it's a little bit hard to speculate on sort of the prospect of union organization for college athletes. But the prospect of introducing a form of group licensing for athletes is an idea that has been percolating around, within some.
Interesting.
Gabe Feldman from Tulane has offered to the Knight Commission, and there are some pretty smart people who have come up with some ideas about the idea of coming up with some ways of having group licensing across segments of college athletes or within schools or within conferences. Or some ways of doing that, which is different from unionization, but does bring some degree of order to the process.
Are you a little bit surprised that, coming out of Northwestern, actually, I want to ask you about that specific case, the NLRB deciding to do what they do, actually deciding to not do anything essentially except to make a statement that they were on the side of the Northwestern players. From what I remember, that was somewhat unprecedented. What did you think of the federal government's response to that request by the Northwestern players and how it played out?
I mean, I think the fact that the NLRB sort of punted on the question, sort of a little bit leaves it a little bit up in the air about how this would play out. I mean, I think it would seem to make it pretty difficult for somebody to do this. And there were a lot of gyrations that went through. And the other thing is, too, we don't know what the outcome of that vote was at Northwestern. That was never made public. So we don't know whether or not the athletes at Northwestern voted to organize or not.
Right. It's just fascinating to me when you think about state schools. I mean, even some of the lower profile state schools, you would think barrier to entry to unionize at a place like the University of New Mexico with that football team. It's astonishing to me that maybe an outside union organization hasn't approached football programs. Of all places, Northwestern is where it played out. I'm a little bit surprised.
Well, that had to do with a public school, private school thing. I mean, there are a lot of other restrictions and regulations having to do with the ability to organize at public institutions. That's why they deliberately chose a private school.
And to that end, if you look at the Cal system, right, and you have a student employee union, let's just say at UCLA, you're a student worker at UCLA. Why shouldn't the football team be involved in that student employee union? I mean, is that a natural transition that could take place at some place in some state involving football programs where they have student employee unions throughout the university system in those states?
Yeah, you'll have to get a court to be willing to allow athletes to be considered workers. I mean, there was a case recently that was decided at the appellate level that rejected that idea of athletes being employees of the schools.
That's why I've got you on.
So legally, so far, that doesn't exist.
That's outstanding stuff, Steve. I can't thank you enough for your expertise. Thanks so much for dropping by and filling us in on all this stuff.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me on.
That's Steve Berkowitz of USA Today. And man, is he giving us some information there? And I'm so, I come in here and I'm so enthusiastic and I'm firing barbs, but he is the guy, the very analytical guy. And if you follow him on Twitter, and it's by Berkowitz, B-Y Berkowitz, Berkowitz, he is a guy who is at the forefront of this issue and any issue as it pertains to college athletics when it comes to everything that we just talked about, but also things like for coaches, which if we had a little more time, I would have asked him about. I didn't want to keep him all day, but that's great information. And I know I'm fired up about it. And I think that there's a happy medium between somebody like me, right? I'm out shooting from the hip, shooting from the lip, if you will, right, on this subject. And we talked about it a little bit. I think it's the same principle with Brian Davis of the Austin American-Statesman. I think you've got people inside who see the realities of the situation legally. They live in that world, and they live in such a world where there's regulation and there's courts, and you've got to consider all of those things, all of those barriers. But guess what? This is a landmark thing. It's an astonishing injustice that's being perpetrated on college football and college basketball players. And I think for that reason, when it's gone on this long, and you've had these sort of empty, to me, amoral, immoral defenses of this vestige of discrimination, whatever you want to call it. I'm not necessarily saying racial, but it's kind of hard to get around that. I think you have to inject some dynamism into the situation. I think Twitter is a great platform for that. And people like me, confronting the individuals who happen to be on Twitter in a civil manner, because this, to me, is such a monstrous injustice. And so it's something that God knows we're going to cover, at the very least, because this affects college football. This affects college basketball. It's going to affect how good your team is. If Cal and UCLA and Stanford and USC can offer players, hey, as he mentioned before, there's a car dealer in Westwood who wants to pay every UCLA recruit. We'll put his jersey number up and we'll put his name on the back of the jersey in the restaurant. Wants to pay you for that, or to do a spot and have your likeness and name involved in it. And you can't do that at the University of Alabama. They don't have that card to play. Guess what? UCLA is going to have a big advantage in recruiting. So that's the heart of the matter here. And that's the heart of the NCAA's ridiculous defense. Their defense isn't, hey, look, we acknowledge this is unfair. No, there's nothing like that. Totally. And they truly are an amoral organization. This is all about, for them, in their defense, well, it would provide an unfair advantage for SC and UCLA. That's the defense. Now, they've had worse defenses than that. Ridiculous it is. They're not challenging the unfair conditions that are inherent that they won. No. It's unfair to Ole Miss that they may not get that player, because that player might not get that money from the car dealer who wants to advertise on behalf of that player at USC or Stanford or Cal. And I'll guarantee you what's going to end up happening here. And it's already happening, and Steve described it. But in Colorado, Washington State, and I know the state of North Carolina, there's already legislation pending. They're waiting to see what the outcome is here in California. Will Governor Newsom act on this? Will he veto it? No. He won't. He's either going to sign it or not sign it. If he doesn't sign it, it'll go into law. And then in 2023, we'll have it. Because what is the NCAA going to do? There's no chance, less than no chance, that the NCAA can say and have it stick. Guess what, USC, UCLA? Guess what, Pac-12 members? You're no longer going to get a chance to compete for the college football player for the Final Four. UCLA, right? I don't think so. USC football, you're not going to get a shot at the college football playoff because we say so, because of the all the big bad boys and girls in Sacramento passing this ridiculously fair law, which is what it is. But now what you have is the implementation of this law is so confusing. It's so contrived. Why? Because we have such an unfair situation in the first place. That's why you get, well, how are we going to do this? Do just some of the players get paid? What if not all of the players? That's when you heard Steve talking about group licensing. That potentially could be a solution. I think a lot of people are looking at this, by the way, as a possibility, as a kind of a middle ground, rather than directly compensate players for playing, which I think is what should happen, because that's going to be far more equitable across the board than doing the likeness thing. We're just going to take the halves among the players, the guys that are famous, the starters, whoever they are, and they're going to make money and everybody else gets screwed. I think at the very least, the NCAA would rather have that than have a compensation model where players are paid equally or on a certain scale, depending on playing time, whatever it is, right? So this is going to be a going discussion as we talk about the future of college football. This could be the biggest story in the United States before the end of the year, because you're going to have state legislatures scrambling like in Alabama. They're going to mobilize overnight. If they know USC can offer money to a player, they can't. Of course, they're already giving players money. That goes without saying under the table. But I'll guarantee you, overnight, and it just goes to show you when you hear people talk about, well, to get a law passed, to get the bill through, it's going to take, that's baloney. Forget about it. I mean, in the state of Alabama, they have criminalized NCAA violations. Now we've got, assistant coaches going to prison, federal prison. You probably know about that because Alabama initiated, these are federal laws now, but in Alabama initiated the idea that an NCAA violation could be a criminal violation. So let's go out now to visit with Barton Simmons, who I believe is in Nashville with us. He's the director of scouting for 24/7 Sports, and it is an honor and a pleasure to talk to Barton, who also, in addition to his duties at 24/7, is part of one of my favorite podcasts. I guess, Barton, you could say it's in my starting rotation, man. You and Chip Patterson and Tom Fornelli do a phenomenal job on the Cover 3 podcast. Look that up wherever you get your podcast and subscribe. Get that into your inbox. Man, I appreciate it, Barton. Thanks a lot for coming on today.
No, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate you saying that about the podcast. We have fun with it. We try to be reasoned and talk about the things we know, admit what we don't. But hey, I'm always very appreciative, and I'm obviously a fan of what you've been able to accomplish as well. So appreciate you having me on.
Describe for people who don't know what it is that you do, Barton.
So I've kind of a two-part gig. I'm with 24/7 Sports, and I sort of oversee our scouting in terms of sort of the player evaluation rankings, 4 or 5-star recruits.
This is college football
for high school kids going to college, and then
right.
On the college side, I sort of, I do our podcast, which CBS produces, and I write for CBS, write for 24/7, do video stuff. So kind of a analyst on the college side, and very much a scout is sort of my main gig on the high school to college recruiting side. So the fun of that is I kind of get to, the insight that I gain from evaluating all these guys and following their recruitments, it actually is helpful and translates to sort of watching these guys on the college level, and gives me some insight and some sort of depth and perspective on rosters and personnel that I think is unique. And so that's it's been fun to dig in on the college side the last few years.
Yeah, and I want to go into some specifics on some teams and some matchups coming up this weekend. But I wanted to say one thing, and I said it off the top, Barton, of the show, is one of the things that I think the NFL has an advantage over when it comes to college football, and maybe why college football's popularity, although it's bigger than the NBA and Major League Baseball, it might be even bigger than what it is because you have so much player turnover, and we don't necessarily have the fantasy aspect drilled down that we have in the NFL. But you're kind of one of the few guys that bridges that gap because you have this extraordinary in-depth knowledge of all the personnel on these college teams. That's why I go to you for your knowledge and for your insight, because you have that level of knowledge that people might have of an NFL roster, but it applies to college.
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously that's really what's driven our business at 24/7 Sports is sort of the fan hunger to follow the recruiting in the off season, have something to dig into and to follow and to track and keep you engaged in the off season. And it really is. I mean, and particularly now with there's a lot less guesswork to it, particularly on the big program level. That there's look every year. I mean, we're seeing true freshman quarterbacks in the national championship game and the college football playoffs regularly. It's going to be an outlier this year if we don't see a true freshman quarterback starting in the college football playoffs. And so I think with the kind of impact that guys are making I think with the advancements in terms of technology and sort of the ability to access film, see these guys in camps, like there's just a lot less misses. And so it's much more translatable than it was maybe a decade, 20 years ago. So it's worthwhile to kind of keep an eye on these guys. And like you said, kind of have a grip on who they are as they hit the big stage.